Hello, everyone. Settlers Lament back again. Um, and I'm here today with John Salza, a Catholic author and full-time attorney. He's the author of a number of books, but in particular, most relevant for today is True or False Pope, along with Robert Sisko. Um, so we're going to be talking about that today, as well as John Salza's journey out of the SSPX, which for a number of years he was a member of. So that's basically what's on the agenda today. So I mean, I probably I should ask you first though to give a bit of your background other than what I've just described here. What would you like to tell us about yourself, John?
No, that's fine. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, I've Catholic apologist. I've been doing Catholic apologetics for quite some time, over 20 years, focusing on church doctrine, history. Done a lot of work in the area of Fatima, Freemasonry, and then most recently focusing on some of the errors, frankly, that have plagued the traditional movement, and that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Yeah, I have your website, True or False Pope, linked in the description. I'd really encourage everyone to check it out. It's really good. There's a lot of information there that I haven't been able to find anywhere else. So anyone that's interested in the topic, and in particular, there's lots of stuff not just about Sedevacantism, but also about the SSPX. So I'd really encourage anyone that's interested in this stuff to check it out. Also, before I get into the questions that I had sent you, that I just had one other I thought of. Are you by any chance considering writing a book on the SSPX stuff?
I mean, it's possible. We're accumulating a lot of information, and I'm considering writing a book that deals with the proper ecclesiology of the church, the study of the nature of the church, and where I think there have been errors on both the right and the left. So that's something that Robert and I, Sisko, are considering for the future.
Okay, cool. Thanks. So I'm getting into the more scheduled questions. And I've read the whole book. I just finished it a couple days ago. It was very interesting. Like I said, in addition to recommending the website, I would definitely recommend the book. And also, actually, sorry, another question, I guess. I had heard that you're working on a second edition. Do you know when that's planned?
Yeah, I would mention that the first edition that you just read is now actually available in an ebook and Kindle. It can be purchased through Amazon, which is a pretty good deal since the book originally came out at about 40 some dollars, and we're selling it for $10 for $9.99. So that can be acquired online. We've added to that book, which is about 800 pages, another 400 pages of material. Frankly, just additional support for all the conclusions that we reached in the book. Our conclusions have remained 100% consistent. But we've been able to add to the material by digging deeper into a lot of the Latin theology manuals that we've had translated from Cajetan, Bellarmine, Suarez, John of St. Thomas, and so forth, in addition to being able to rebut the objections that came out after the book was published from a number of clerics and lay Sedevacantists. So we have been able to penetrate more deeply into their objections and further expose their errors. And so we're continuing to work on that. It seems to be pretty fluid, but hopefully that will be accomplished at some point.
Okay, thanks. So getting into more of the scheduled questions, how was it exactly that you first got interested in the topic of Sedevacantism and writing a book on that topic?
Well, as a Catholic apologist, being moved to explain and defend the teachings of the church, a lot of that involves rebutting the errors of the Protestants, and Sedevacantists are nothing more than Protestants insofar as they hold a Protestant ecclesiology. Of course, they don't hold all the doctrines of the Protestants. I'm not saying that, but their understanding of the church is Protestant because Sedevacantists essentially believe that the church is nothing more than those who profess the true faith, the spiritual entity. And in doing that, they not only reject the Pope, but they reject the church itself, since the church is a visible institution with four marks, with attributes. And so, it led me to address their arguments the same way that I have through many of my books addressed the Protestant arguments against the church. And I would put them in that same camp. They don't all hold and believe the same things, but they do profess the same ecclesiology in what the church is and the nature of the church.
Okay, yeah, no, that definitely was one of the points that I really found compelling in the book. that Sedevacantists, when you speak to them, and I have spoken to them occasionally in the past, they try to make this sort of just a technical question about who is and isn't the Pope, when really it's a much bigger issue than that. It's not just a disagreement over the Pope; it's a disagreement over the Church itself.
Correct. Very, very good point. And that's to be made very clear. They don't just reject the Pope; they reject the Roman Catholic Church. They do not believe that the Church of Rome, headed by Pope Francis and his bishops and cardinals, is the true church. Okay. Now, they can't tell you where the true church is. Just ask them. They can't tell you. What they will say is that the true church isn't the Bergoglian church. And so that is effectively a rejection of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I mean, if Sedevacantism were to have any legs, I would think that there would have needed to be like half a dozen cardinals break off in 1958. But because that never happened, that's why they have to default to a Protestant ecclesiology.
Correct.
But yes, so what is it that were the main problems that you identify with Sedevacantism? Like the main things that make it really clear that Sedevacantism can't be true?
Well, they deny the attributes and marks of the Roman Catholic Church. For example, as we explain in the book, the church has a number of attributes that will always be part of the church, okay, to the end of time. One of those is indefectibility, that there is an episcopacy, a primacy with the Pope's office, and an episcopacy. These are divinely established offices that our Lord established with ordinary jurisdiction, and that attribute will always be in the church. The Sedevacantists cannot say that the church is indefectible. They say just the opposite, that they say the church has defected, that the entire hierarchy has defected. So they deny that mark. Visibility is another one. This is a most distinguishing mark of the Catholic Church, and it's one of the attributes that really distinguish the Roman Catholic Church from all of the other so-called Christian sects or religions, because the visibility of the Roman Catholic Church is known by her hierarchical structure, the social unit, which is comprised of the Pope and the bishops and the clergy and the laity. That attribute of the church will always be present, will always be visible throughout the world. Even if for a time it must go underground, it will always retain its attribute of visibility. Now, the Sedevacantists reject that because they have reduced the church, the true church, in their view, as simply those who profess the true faith. Well, the Protestants, of course, are visible people, but looking at a Protestant church, it's not the true Church of Christ, because there's not the visible hierarchical juridical structure that would exist in the Catholic Church. So, those are some of the marks or the attributes that they reject. And in terms of the marks, when we say one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic, again, their ecclesiology rejects all of the marks, in addition to all of the attributes. Like one, when we say the church is one, well, she's one in government. That is one of the most obvious signs of the Roman Catholic Church, that she's truly one in government, governed by a supreme authority, the Pope who lives in Rome, in the Church of Rome, and all of those who are legally connected to him through the juridical structure, the cardinals, the bishops, the priests, the clergy, one in government. And that government flows through from the supreme authority all the way down to the diocesan parish. And this is all held together as a matter of the church's governance. Apostolic, when we say the church is apostolic, now that refers to not just the material succession, the fact that we have bishops who truly have succeeded to the apostles and their successors and so forth, not just through the material succession, that is the laying on of hands or the episcopal consecration, but also formally through apostolic succession, which is the jurisdiction that has been handed on from the Pope through the bishops. And again, the Sedevacantists cannot point to a church that has formal apostolic succession. Only the Roman Catholic Church does. Only the Roman Catholic Church can trace the papacy and the episcopacy through her jurisdiction all the way back to the apostles. So, these were the most obvious signs to me of the errors of Sedevacantism. And as I said before, they can't tell you where the true church is. They will only tell you where it isn't, and they'll say it's not in Rome. You see, so that is a big problem for their inability to tell us where the church is, and yet they claim that they're a member of the true church.
Yeah, very, very well taken. I also, on that point, one part of the book that I found really fascinating was actually a footnote where you guys demonstrated that the often cited quote from St. Athanasius that even if Catholics faithful to tradition are reduced to a handful, they are the ones who are the true Church of Jesus Christ. That quote is false, because I've seen that quote for many years, both among traditionalists and Sedevacantists, and I never questioned it. I assumed it was authentic. So I thought it was very interesting that was a false quote that's been circulating for so long.
Yeah, we dug into the Latin and discovered it was false. And, there are a number of clerics, including Father Kramer, who have been promoting the idea that the church could be reduced only to a handful of people. And when we published it and proved that it was false, he had to admit that it was also false. So he's acquiesced to that. And yet he and many others who are Sedevacantists like him claim that the church can be reduced to a few people, which is not possible, because when we say one holy Catholic and apostolic, the Catholicity of the church means that she will always have large number of members throughout the world. Whether or not they truly have the supernatural virtue of faith in their souls is not relevant to the question of Catholicity. Catholicity simply means externally there will always be a large number of members of the Catholic Church throughout the world. The theology manuals refer to it as moral Catholicity. That there again will be a large number of Catholics, and as the gospel ultimately is preached throughout all four corners of the world, will be a great number of Catholics. So the church cannot possibly be reduced to simply a few Catholics, whether it's a handful or 100 or 1,000, because that actually denies the mark of Catholicity.
Yeah, and especially another explanation you had in the book that I found very interesting was for the end times prophecies. That, as you said, the church needs to retain moral Catholicity, but it's possible for the end times prophecies of Christ and other figures to be fulfilled by the number of people in the church that actually possess faith being reduced to a very small amount of people.
That's right,
and that's certainly that's an explanation I've never heard previously.
Yeah, that's right. A distinction between the external or ecclesiastical forum, which shows who is legally a member of the church in the external forum, versus the internal forum, the interior forum, the spiritual life of those who are in a state of grace.
Yeah. So yes. And another question. So really central to the whole Sedevacantism debate is can a pope be a heretic? Can you expand on that question?
Sure.
What the answer is and what that means?
Sure, I'd be happy to. There are 5 opinions about this, and we've written about this in great detail in our book. And if you don't mind, I can briefly go through those opinions. They are opinions because the Catholic Church has not adjudicated which one is correct. So it is permissible to hold these opinions. The Church hasn't defined how a pope actually loses his office, or if he's able to lose his office. So we need to be clear on that. Now, Bellarmine wrote about the 5 opinions in his writings, De Romano Pontifice. The first opinion is the opinion that a pope cannot fall into heresy ever. And that's effectively no longer a credible opinion. I mean, I guess a few hold that, but there have been a number of popes, such as Pope Innocent III and a number of others, who actually say that, and they officially teach this to the church, that a pope could fall into heresy. A pope could never bind the church to heresy in his binding and loosing authority because of the attribute of infallibility. Christ and the Holy Ghost would prevent the pope from binding the church to heresy, but he could fall into heresy. He could even teach heresy. So we don't believe that the first opinion is credible, but it's still permissible to hold it. The second opinion is the position that if a pope falls into heresy, he is ipso facto deposed by a matter of divine law. Now, this is actually the Sedevacantist opinion, even though they don't admit that it is, but it is effectively what the Sedevacantists believe. They believe that if a pope is manifesting signs of heresy or preaching heresy, he's ipso facto opposed as a matter of divine law. And by the way, they can determine it by their own private judgment without any involvement of the Roman Catholic Church. And this position is false. Bellarmine clearly rejected this second opinion. As Bellarmine says, God makes a man a pope with the cooperation of men, and therefore God deposes a pope with the cooperation of men. This was how Bellarmine reasoned his way through that. And so on that basis, Bellarmine rejected the second opinion. The third opinion is that if a pope falls into heresy, even if it's public and notorious heresy, he keeps his office. We're stuck with him. There's nothing you can do because the pope cannot be judged. The axiom, the first see, is judged by no one. And Bellarmine rejected this opinion as well. And it's very clear in his writings that he says that in the case of heresy, this is one of the cases where an inferior can actually judge a superior. And that's basically a quote verbatim from Bellarmine. And so, we would reject that opinion as well, but it's permissible to hold it. The fourth and the fifth opinion, really, we believe are the most credible and probable correct opinions. The fourth opinion, which we refer to in our book as the Dominican opinion, because they're based upon the writings of Cajetan and John of St. Thomas, great Dominican theologians. This opinion states that if a pope is falling into heresy, he would be subject to ecclesiastical warnings. He would be warned that he had to correct himself. And if the pope remained what's called pertinacious, obstinate in his heresy, then the church could declare that the crime of heresy has been committed. But under this opinion, he still would not be ipso facto deposed yet. What would have to happen, and John of St. Thomas goes into incredible detail on this, and he's just absolutely brilliant. He says that the church, after declaring heresy, which doesn't strip the pope of his office, has to actually declare the pope vitandus. That is, that he must be avoided. And so under this opinion, what happens, and this is based on revelation, this is based on St. Paul's letter to Titus 3:10, where St. Paul says after two warnings, multiple warnings, avoid the heretic. So this opinion states that after the crime has been established by the church, and the church has a right to determine whether the crime of heresy has been committed, that is, by the way, not a coercive judgment over the pope, it's simply a judgment of the facts based upon his pertinacity. The church would then declare the faithful to avoid the pope. Okay, so what's happening here is there is a legal declaration imploring the faithful to avoid the pope, to separate from the pope. Again, nothing is happening coercively over the pope. The church is declaring the faithful to avoid the pope. So the church, under the Dominican opinion, legally separates from the pope. The church is not cutting the pope off. The church has judged that he has already cut himself off by the fact that they've established pertinacity. And so in declaring to the church that the pope must be legally avoided, John of St. Thomas explains that this really renders the now fallen pope's ministry impotent. He no longer has subjects, so he can no longer exercise the papacy. He's no longer the pope. He falls from office, and the church can proceed with the election of a new pope. I favor this opinion, as I do most Dominican theology, because it is soundly based on revelation. So it's certainly a credible opinion. And then we have the fifth opinion, which was Bellarmine's opinion. We call this the Jesuit opinion, since it came from Bellarmine and Francisco Suarez. And it's also a permissible opinion to hold. The Sedevacantists claim that they hold the fifth opinion, but they actually don't hold the fifth opinion. I can explain why. But the fifth opinion says the Pope is ipso facto deposed as soon as he falls into heresy. Now, that kind of sounds like the second opinion, but it's not, because in the second opinion, the position is that the Pope loses his office ipso facto as a matter of divine law. Okay, but in the fifth opinion, the church is involved in the determination of whether the crime of heresy has occurred, which is what the Sedevacantists err when they think they adopt the fifth opinion. By losing the office ipso facto, that doesn't preclude an antecedent judgment from the church. And in fact, there is an antecedent judgment of the church before the Pope loses his office. St. Bellarmine, and I've written an article on this, Robert and I have, you can find it on our website. St. Robert refers to this as the discretionary judgment. And this is the way St. Robert Bellarmine gets around the truth that no one can coercively judge the Pope, a sitting Pope. So what Bellarmine says is, prior to him being ipso facto deposed, there's an antecedent judgment whereby the church, not coercively, but only looking at the facts, only determining whether the Pope is pertinacious in his heresy, like the Dominican opinion, through a discretionary judgment determines that the Pope has in fact severed himself. And it's at that point that, under the Jesuit opinion, that the church declares he is no longer the Pope. There isn't the extra vitandus declaration that the Dominicans hold. It's simply then that the church declares he is no longer a Pope, and then only then, because the Pope, former Pope, has severed himself from the church through his pertinacity, only then can a coercive judgment take place whereby the church can replace him. He can depose him and proceed to a conclave and elect him and physically remove him if necessary. And that's based on the understanding that the church has a right to provide for its head, right? Just as I said before, just as God makes a man a pope with the cooperation of men, so he also deposes a pope with the cooperation of men. So really the fourth and the fifth opinions, which again we call in our book the Dominican and Jesuit opinions, are really the key opinions and probably the most correct. And I side with the Dominicans, not just because I'm a lay Dominican myself, but it would seem to me that the church, not only in declaring the heresy, would also have to follow St. Paul's injunction to declare the Pope vitandus. This would seem to be part of the process. You declare that the Pope has severed himself, the crime is established, and then the church has to reveal that. Because if this happens behind the doors of an imperfect council, let's say, how will the faithful actually know what happened? So the church presumably would have to communicate this to the faithful by declaring to the faithful he's no longer Pope and avoid him. But again, those are the five opinions. They're all permissible opinions. The church hasn't ruled definitively on which one to hold. And hopefully that gives people some background of this very, very technical and complicated area.
Yeah, thanks very much. So one commenter asked on what you've just discussed, who would make the declaration that is required under the Dominican and Jesuit opinions that the Pope would be deposed? The College of Cardinals, Bishops' Council. Yeah,
that's a great question. If you read all of the theologians in context, particularly John of St. Thomas, the ecclesiastical warnings would likely come from the cardinals, the College of Cardinals, just because they're the ones that elected him, so they're the ones that are going to initiate the warnings. But the determination of whether the crime of heresy has occurred and then the following vitandus declaration would come from an imperfect council. And even Bellarmine says that the church should have a right to call a council, even against the Pope's will, to carry out this discretionary judgment. Again, it's not coercive. No one has coercive authority over the Pope, but the church has a right to provide for its head. This is one case where an inferior can judge a superior, all this according to Bellarmine, and it would be done through a council. So it would be the world's bishops gathering to determine this most grave matter. This is not going to be handled by a handful of cardinals. This is going to be through an imperfect because the Pope wouldn't be presiding, imperfect though, because the episcopacy is called worldwide to decide this most grave issue.
Yeah, thanks. So what type of responses have Sedevacantists given, in particular to your analysis of Bellarmine, since this is them claiming to adopt his position is central to their beliefs? How have they tried to defend that they do actually hold to Bellarmine's position?
I haven't heard a cogent rebuttal at all to what I've just said. What they claim And a lot of, the five opinions, the reason why this is so tricky is when you think of these five opinions, what the theologians have struggled with is how to get around the fact that the Pope cannot be judged by human authority. That's really been the tricky part of going through these opinions. And this is where the theologians from the Jesuits and the Dominicans, they were all struggling with this. And they came up as a matter of reason and precedent that there can be a discretionary judgment. And they look to Revelation, and they look to the fact that St. Paul says you can warn a superior, you can give him warnings. Warnings is not coercive. It's an act of charity. It's an act of seeking the truth. You can warn, and if the person proves that he's obstinate, again, that's not a coercive judgment. The Pope is simply proving that he himself has departed from the magisterium, right? Because the ultimate judge here is the dogma of the Catholic faith. If the Pope has been warned that he is not following the dogma and he's rejecting the dogma, that he's a heretic, that he's denying or at least doubting the dogma of the faith, he himself is proving in the ecclesiastical form that he has separated from the magisterium. None of that is coercive. The Sedevacantists are saying, you guys think that the church can judge the Pope and has authority over the Pope, and that's not true. This only happens by a matter of divine law. I mean, that's really what their rebuttal is. That's not what we're saying at all. It's not a matter of divine law because, as all of these theologians have said, a Pope could never be deposed in secret. This is not a matter of divine law because the Roman Catholic Church has to know who's their Pope. Okay, so this can't be a secret deposition behind closed doors. That is absurd. But it's also not a coercive judgment over the Pope by human authority because that's absurd, because the Pope cannot be judged coercively, but he can be judged discretionarily in a fact-finding process whereby the Pope proves himself to be a heretic, proves that he himself has separated from the church. And the church can make that judgment. The church can judge the facts and then implement a process to depose him and elect a new pope.
Yeah. So, so what about an objection I've heard from Sedevacantists? I believe this was Father Cicada's main objection to your book before he passed. Was that what I believe he said? It's been a while since I read this from him. It was before I read your book. But I believe what he said is that he doesn't believe that there were popes in the first place. He believes that that John the 23rd was already a heretic, so he was unable to be elected pope. Why is that incorrect?
Well, it's incorrect for the same reasons. Number one, he doesn't have the authority to determine that. The church does. But number two, he's buying into the notion that a pope can be secretly deposed. At some point, these guys, according to Cicada's theory, would have lost their office and weren't even eligible to be elected. But it begs the same question. When, at what point did they lose their office? And if they lost their office, how come nobody in the conclave knew it? And how come nobody all of the people in the conclave actually elected this pope and then accepted this pope and presented him to the universal church? Those are impossibilities because a pope isn't secretly deposed. Christ is not going to deceive his entire church, whereby a secret deposition takes place and the entire church is following a false pope. If that were the case, remember what I said at the beginning, that would deny the attribute of indefectibility of the church, which is a permanent attribute that always exists within the Roman Catholic Church. So there's no way to get around the fact that whatever position they take, whether these popes were not popes to begin with, which Father Cicada actually changed his position to that. He first held that they lost their office, and then he changed his position and said they never had it to begin with. But whether they take that position or whether they take the position that they later lose their office, they're going to end by denying the marks and attributes of the church.
Yeah, very well taken. Also a story that you relate in the book that I think illustrated the issue with either of you very well was of the Archbishop of Paris during Vatican I, who before and after Vatican I was overtly denying papal infallibility. And I believe it was for about a year until after the council had already concluded, he continued to deny papal infallibility. And he was very clearly never regarded as having lost as having lost his as having lost his office.
I think Cardinal Manning can be included in that, if that's who you're referring to. There were a number of others. We have many examples during the pontificate of St. Pius X of clerics that were clearly teaching heresy. that didn't lose their positions in the church, but in terms of the clerics, that's a great example where if that would be the case, then such a cleric wouldn't have been allowed to participate in councils because he would have lost his office. So none of this happens in secret. Now, they say these things happen in secret because remember, their ecclesiology is Protestant. They believe that the church is nothing more than a spiritual reality of people who profess the true faith. And therefore, they think that depositions occur spiritually or secretly without ecclesiastical authority because they reject the Roman Catholic Church as a visible hierarchical institution. They reject the formal visibility, indefectibility, Catholicity, apostolicity, on and on and on. They reject the Catholic Church as this visible hierarchical structure and see it only as a spiritual reality, just like the Protestants. And that's why they think that depositions can happen spiritually under divine law, in the internal form, even though nobody knows about it but themselves. So it's absurd.
Yeah. And another question from the chat. How do you avoid the charge of conciliarism in view of CCC 884?
Sure, because in conciliarism, you're putting the council above the authority of the Pope. And in the Dominican and Jesuit opinion, that doesn't happen at all. As I said, these judgments are not coercive, and hence the council that is called is not above the Pope's authority. The council is simply determining whether the Pope is a heretic without exercising coercive authority over him. So there's a distinction between what the church can determine in her discretion by looking at the facts, and then what the church actually carries out through her coercive authority after he falls from office. Once the discretionary judgment takes place, which again, I keep saying this, it's a non-coercive judgment, but the church has a right to judge the facts. Only then, when the Pope has proven himself, the Pope, remember, has proven himself to be a heretic by separating from the church and the magisterium by his pertinacity. Only then, after the church has determined that he has fallen from office, can it then act with authority over him. And the reason why that is, of course, is because he's no longer the Pope. He's a mere man. At that point, then the church can remove and depose him. So this is not at all the era of conciliarism. Certainly, John of St. Thomas and Bellarmine knew, that heresy and worked through the procedure whereby you would get around it.
Yeah. So yeah, that basically concludes for all my questions on Sedevacantism. Unless there's anything else you would like to bring up about that before we move on to the SSPX stuff.
That sounds good.
Okay. Actually, one other, not really Sedevacantism per se, but not SSPX either. The same commenter had also asked earlier the issue of Benevacantism. Is there anything you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an impossibility. And what I've heard all the arguments for that position, but what every single proponent of that position has failed to understand is that when the Pope is universally accepted by the church, okay, that is a dogmatic fact. That's considered a definitive judgment by the magisterium. If you look at the church's profession of faith, that would be a category 2 judgment, which is considered infallible. Okay, when the church proposes a man as Pope, that is an infallible judgment of the magisterium. Category 2, read the profession of faith. Read Cardinal Ratzinger's commentary, the very man that they claim is Pope. He's the one that shows us in the theology of the church that it's not possible. And because it is an infallible judgment of the magisterium, that means that we are required to submit to it with supernatural faith. Okay, and because we're required to submit to the judgment with supernatural faith, not to do so would be a mortal sin against the church, a mortal sin against the faith itself. Right? And Cardinal Ratzinger also says that mortal sin separates us from the church. We are no longer in communion with the church. Again, this is all in Cardinal Ratzinger's theological commentary under John Paul II. And so there have been cases, in church history where you had multiple claimants. Great Western Schism comes to mind. But in this case, there is only one claimant to the papacy. It's Pope Francis. Now you can say there's all this innuendo about Benedict and what he really means, and all the this Gnostic interpretation of the things he said and how he compares himself and what he wears and Pope Emeritus and this and that. But the reality is, Pope Benedict has said that he is no longer the Pope. He himself has said that in the most clear and certain terms. I mean, when he declared his resignation, it couldn't have been clearer when he says that, the office will be vacant. When he refers to the office of the papacy and the chair of Peter and the chair of the primacy, he's referring to each and every privilege that attaches to that office, okay? Both the spiritual privileges as well as the ecclesiastical privileges that he has as Pope. So the fact that Benedict tied his resignation to the vacancy of the chair of Peter is about the most comprehensive resignation that you could possibly have. And by the way, the church doesn't tell us or dictate how the Pope is supposed to resign. He didn't even have to do that. But in my view, it was the most comprehensive statement one could have, because he attached the vacancy to the office itself. And so if the office is vacant, he holds nothing. He doesn't even hold on to the spiritual elements of the papacy, even if he thought he did. Even if Benedict was in error about what he thought he retained, he wouldn't retain it. Okay. And again, because this is the definitive judgment of the magisterium, Christ himself severs the bond. Another thing that these proponents don't understand is that it is Jesus Christ who makes a man the Pope by joining the matter to the form. It's also Christ himself who severs the bond by separating the matter of the form. You see? And so when the resignation was effected in the external forum, and Pope declared that he no longer held the office and all of the rights and privileges of the primacy that is endowed with that office, Christ severed the bond. He's no longer the Pope.
Okay, good. Yeah, I definitely agree. And so moving on to the SSPX stuff, this topic I actually think is probably a lot more important than Sedevacantism, because in my experience, Sedevacantism is almost exclusively a very niche internet movement. I mean, I do of course know there are some real Sedevacantist chapels out there and bishops and stuff, but it seems to be very, very small. And niche, where and I don't think I've ever met a Catholic in real life who professes to be a Sedevacantist, but I very regularly do meet people in real life who hold beliefs similar to the SSPX or are outright supporters of the SSPX. I just this last weekend I was having a conversation with a guy who attends an FSSP parish, but agreed with the SSPX on certain things. So this topic I really think is very important because it's something that that seems a lot more Catholics get involved in. So yeah, that's not a question. I just want to briefly introduce it with that. But on that point, how is it exactly that you got involved in the SSPX in the first place? In particular, I believe I read in one of the articles on your website that you had initially been critical of them. So how was it that you overcame that and got involved with them?
Yeah, it's a good question. As I reflected on this, I had been attending a traditional diocesan Latin Mass, for a number of years. And one of my friends was telling me that he was going to go to the Society Mass of St. Pius X, and what I thought of it. I didn't know much about it. So I looked into it briefly, and I immediately found John Paul II's Motu Proprio, the Ecclesia Dei Afflicta, where he declared the society to be a schismatic movement, not to adhere to that movement. And so, it's strange, as Providence would have it, I actually typed a letter to my friend and signed it. I signed my name to it, and he can produce it if he wants to. He knows who he is. This was about 20 years ago. And I said, look, this is a concern of mine. You're my friend, and this is what John Paul II has said. So that was my initial insights into the society. And then a few years later, I moved into a different part of my state where I was about 12 minutes away from the society chapel. And I knew what I had written in the letter. And I said, I'm wondering if I can attend the Mass on the weekends because it's so convenient. Otherwise, I'm going to have close to an hour to the diocesan Latin Mass, given my new house. So I began looking at some of the things the society said. And again, I wanted to attend the traditional liturgy. And I read, statements from the society that because there was a crisis in the church, They're created a state of necessity, right, whereby you could attend our mass and receive our sacraments. And again, that kind of appealed to me. I mean, the very reason why I was attending the traditional Latin Mass in the diocese was because I did recognize that there was a crisis. You know, even before that, a long time ago, I was jumping from one Novus Ordo parish to another, trying to find a mass that I would be comfortable in. You know, and I couldn't do it. And I can't tell you how many churches, how many parishes I went. You know, I went from one to the other, and it was miserable. So I finally found the traditional Mass and settled on that. And so my motivation initially was I want the traditional Mass, and I was superficially satisfied with, well, you know, I'm not formally adhering, as John Paul II said. I'm just going to Mass there on Sunday with the family. During the week, I still attended the diocesan Latin Mass, and then it actually then became the Institute of Christ the King when they moved into Wisconsin. And so that's kind of how it played out. And then, you know, after we wrote the book True or False Pope, and I became more familiar with the church's teaching on mission, on the episcopacy, on canonical mission, on the fact that it's a matter of divine law that Christ sends his ministers, right? Just as he sent his apostles, so now his vicar sends the successors to the apostles. And the divine law is mission, and mission is the divine law. And I thought to myself, boy, I really can't get around that. Now the society is arguing that, you know, there's a state of necessity, but necessity never overrules or trumps the divine law, because the divine law foresees necessity. You see, so to make a long story short, it was primarily my study of ecclesiology and canonical mission and jurisdiction, those areas, which moved me to leave. But the other part of that, I will say, was the errors of Archbishop Lefebvre. After I realized that the society's position on necessity was incorrect, I began studying the writings of Archbishop Lefebvre. I got all his books here, and you know, I was amazed to find one error after another, even heresies, frankly. You know, the Archbishop holding the position that because of this so-called state of necessity, that he had jurisdiction to do whatever he wanted, and he had the ability to impart that jurisdiction upon his successor bishops, which is absurd. I mean, he's on record as saying that jurisdiction comes from the people. That's heretical. He's on record as saying that supplied jurisdiction gives him the right to celebrate the Mass and all the sacraments, which is not true, since you don't even need jurisdiction to celebrate 5 of the 7 sacraments. You only need canonical mission, which he doesn't have. That he claimed he even had ordinary episcopal jurisdiction for certain acts, which is not true. He never specified for what acts he thought he had that, but you know, Pius XII and many other popes, but Pius XII in particular, was clear that, you know, ordinary episcopal jurisdiction only comes from the Pope. It comes from Christ to the Pope, and then from the Pope to the bishops. Well, as I had to realize and face the fact, Archbishop Lefebvre was not sent by the Pope. Just the contrary. He was under censure from the Pope, so he didn't have a canonical mission from the Pope. And then one of the things that was most disturbing is the fact that Archbishop Lefebvre advocated for and would ultimately set up a canonical commission, which is actually a usurpation of the authority of the Holy See and the bishops, whereby now the society makes judgments on marriage impediments and annulments, and they lift censures and dispense from religious vows, clearly schismatic. I mean, Lefebvre himself in his writings say, because the conciliar church is all defected, effectively, they're all modernist, we need to create substitute authorities. This is what Lefebvre actually says. And all of this stuff can be seen on the society websites. And so, you know, these things really, really troubled me. There's no way I could get around the fact that Lefebvre was simply operating without a canonical mission, which is a violation of divine law. You cannot appeal to necessity to circumvent the divine law in the way Christ set up the church. And he was assuming all of this authority for himself. And I could no longer live with that contradiction. That and the way he was acting, and the way he acted, and the way now the bishops and priests of the society act with the Catholic faith. So that's a little long-winded explanation of what led me out of the society.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. One person and another person in chat said about this. I live in the UK where we only have one Catholic school. I just don't have the luxury of being so precious about the SSPX or FSSP or Institute of Christ the King. No offense, Mr. Salza. I'm really sympathetic to this perspective that that this sounds like really technical stuff that most people don't really have a handle on. What is canonical mission, stuff like that. I don't think most Catholics, even most really devout Catholics, I think their eyes probably glaze over when you start talking about this stuff. Why is it that this is something that they should be concerned about?
Well, I know it sounds complicated, but it's not. Mission is fundamental to being a Catholic and what the church is for. Christ created the church to carry out his mission, which is the salvation of souls. Okay, it's very simply that. Now, the society says that the highest law is the salvation of souls, but under divine law, Christ has established how the salvation of souls is to be carried out through his Roman Catholic Church, through the mission that he's entrusted to the church. It's the Catholic Church who carries out mission, who regulates mission, who governs mission, who applies mission. And the mission is the salvation of souls, and the mission is carried out by those who've been sent by the church, by lawful authority. It's as simple as that. Again, mission is carried out by those who have been lawfully sent by Christ through his church. Okay, it's as simple as that. So whoever has not been sent by the church, okay, by the Pope, by the bishops, is not carrying out a Catholic mission and is forbidden. And what happens is when those who are outside the church assume for themselves the role of carrying out mission, what they end up doing is they actually end up leading souls out of the Catholic Church. This is why the society and the Sedevacantists and the resistance, they're making podcasts attacking the Roman Catholic Church. This is how they make their living, if you will. They're not saving souls. They're leading souls out of the church, which ultimately damns souls. We need to be very clear about this. So mission is simple. As the Father sent me, so I sent you. Pius XII teaches that it is Christ through his church who preaches, who baptizes, who sanctifies, but he does it through the ministers that his church sends. He's endowed the church with the authority to send the priests and the bishops, and those are the ones who lawfully carry out Christ's mission.
Yeah, no, very, very good points. So moving on, were the 1988 excommunications of Lefebvre and the four bishops he consecrated valid? And if they weren't, why doesn't the state of necessity that the SSPX cite not apply?
Well, of course, they're valid because they were declared by the supreme authority of the Catholic Church, the Roman Pontiff. So there's no question that they were valid. There is never a state of necessity that can circumvent divine law. Okay, that's the first point. And so when Lefebvre thought that he could set up a counter church with bishops who did not have canonical mission and with priests who were not incarnated and yet could do anything and everything a bishop or priest can do, and actually even more than a bishop or priest, because they assumed for themselves universal powers, unlike most bishops and priests who have territorial powers. Also, the command that John Paul II gave not to consecrate these bishops was within the scope of his authority. And so there's never a necessity not only of circumventing the divine law, which is what Lefebvre and the society have done. They've circumvented the divine law. You cannot appeal to any law to circumvent the divine law, number one. But also, there's never a state of necessity that justifies obeying a papal command that is within the scope of the Pope's authority. Period. Unless it's a command to sin, well, of course, it wouldn't be within the scope of the Pope's authority. But if it's within the scope of the Pope's authority, you have to obey it, as long as it's not a command to sin. And of course, John Paul II had the authority to decide who was going to be consecrated a bishop and who isn't. I mean, that's crystal clear. Any Catholic would acknowledge that. Even bishops have the widest latitude of determining who they're going to ordain as priests. So clearly the Holy Father has the authority as the supreme authority. But as I've mentioned, John Paul II actually did want to give Archbishop Lefebvre a bishop. This was scheduled. John Paul II did give the Archbishop a bishop to consecrate. It was scheduled for August 15th, 1988. And in a matter of hours, Archbishop Lefebvre reneged upon that commitment and said, I need 3 more bishops 6 weeks earlier. And he was warned not to do it. He knew the canonical warning. He knew the consequences of it. Necessity it's not possible to argue necessity, again, as I said, because it circumvents divine law, it circumvents ecclesiastical law, and in this case, it's contrary to reason that he needed 3 more 6 weeks earlier. So yes, the excommunications were valid. This was a schismatic act of disobedience against the Holy Father and a lawful command.
The argument I normally hear from SSPX priests and supporters on this point is that even if they concede that there wasn't a state of necessity, what they usually argue is that Canon 1323 says that a person who, without neglect, thought that one of the circumstances mentioned in point 4.5, and one of those circumstances being a state of necessity, is not subject to these penalties, being excommunication. So the argument that SSPX supporters usually make is, even if there objectively wasn't a state of necessity, that Archbishop Lefebvre certainly thought there was a state of necessity. Why is that incorrect?
Well, it's not a proper rebuttal, because the excommunication was declared in the external forum, and hence the excommunication had all of the juridical effects that proceed from an excommunication, which is cutting the 4 bishops off from the Roman Catholic Church. They were barred from the entire life of the church. They couldn't participate in faith, worship, or governance. They were separated from the beginning, but the excommunication was declared by the supreme authority. Remember, the Pope is the supreme legislature, and when he interprets canon law, it's not just interpretation. His interpretation is the law. That's what Catholics have to understand. The Holy Father's interpretation of canon law is law itself. So as a supreme legislature, that argument just simply doesn't stand.
Okay. So moving on to another question. In the preface to True or False Pope, you argue, now of course I say you here, I don't really know who wrote which part, you or Robert Sisko argued, that the current crisis in the church can be traced back to the erroneous teachings in Vatican II, though these teachings don't harm the indefectibility of the church, because infallibility was not invoked for these teachings. Would you stand by that, or has your position changed on that?
Well, I do tie the crisis to Vatican II, but not because the council taught heresy, as what the Society of St. Pius X claims, but rather because some of the statements can be interpreted in erroneous ways, and hence error can flow from the documents, not positively from the text themselves, but from the interpretations of the way that they've been hijacked, frankly. I mean, the statements can be interpreted in light of tradition, sometimes with great difficulty, and I would acknowledge that. But it's really, I think, a question, in my view, of the ambiguities, right, as opposed to the errors. The problem is that, a lot of these statements, and there aren't many of them. I mean, Bishop Follet even said that he thought that 95% of what the council taught was easily reconciled with tradition. It was like 5%, I think, Bishop Follet said, which really caused the problem. But I think the bigger problem is not the ambiguities, and of course that is problematic, and we might want to have clarification on. But the bigger problem is that a lot of the traditionalists, and certainly the society, is actually misinterpreting what the council says, and misrepresenting what the council says is probably a better way of putting it. For example, the Society of St. Pius X declares that collegiality is a heresy. The document Lumen Gentium. Now, I can tell you, we have articles on this, and we're going to be putting more articles out on this. Collegiality is one of the most beautiful teachings of the council. It is so consistent with tradition. It's what the fathers held at Vatican I. It's all in the theology manuals. The society has totally and completely misrepresented the teaching of collegiality. They don't understand it. The collegiality is simply Christ establishing the episcopacy as a moral body of bishops who share collectively in the supreme and universal jurisdiction of the Pope. entirely dependent upon the Pope and not without him. But when united externally to their head, when there is a Pope, the bishops share in that. They don't possess it individually, and they don't possess the primacy. They don't possess the privileges of the primacy, such as individual infallibility, but they share in the universal jurisdiction collectively. It's called the collegiate power. This is in theology manual after theology manual. It's in Dom Gray's book, which the Society often refers to in an effort to claim that they have supplied jurisdiction, even though Gray doesn't refer to supplied jurisdiction through his book. He refers to the collegiate power or the episcopal power, which is the power that the bishops in union with the Pope share as a college, based upon Christ's revelation in Matthew 18, when he tells the apostolic college, whatever you bind or loose on earth is bound or loosed in heaven. See, this universal binding is a sharing in the universal and supreme jurisdiction that the Pope alone holds. And we see this play out, for example, when there's an ecumenical council, right? The bishops are sharing in the universal authority of the Pope. They participate in an ecumenical council as judges, and this is in the nature of their collegiate power. And for the Society to declare this a heresy is heretical in itself, frankly. They don't understand it. We go into the details of what they've missed on this. Effectively, the Society has conflated the primacy of the Pope with the collegiate power of the episcopacy. They've conflated primacy with supreme authority. Those are two separate and distinct things. And it's a beautiful doctrine. And Vatican II, this is one of the teachings that might be said to be definitive in the council. Many of the teachings are not, we know that, but this is one teaching that's entirely and completely traditional, and yet the Society calls it a heresy.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So moving on your website, you it's particularly in the part where you explain that you're no longer SSPX supporters. You say that you still believe in that recognize and resist is the correct approach to the current problems in the church. What exactly does that mean? And has your understanding of recognize and resist changed at all since leaving the Society?
Well, we still hold the recognize and resist position, but the difference is, the Society claims that they recognize the Pope's authority, but in practice they don't. I mean, that's the reality. In practice, there's been a complete repudiation of papal authority. They have withdrawn from the Roman Catholic churches from the Pope's authority by carrying out this phony mission throughout the world without canonical approval or authority from the Pope. So, we recognize the authority of the Pope. We will resist, and we lay this out in our chapter. We resist to the extent that we're commanded to do something contrary to the faith or something that's contrary to morals, to sin. But Lefebvre didn't just recognize and resist. Okay, what he said is that Vatican II was a new religion, that the Roman Catholic Church now became a conciliar church, that he had a right to substitute authorities for the church. So they really don't live out the resistance the way it's traditionally understood. They actually reject the authorities and they resist lawful commands. There's a distinction there. So yes, we would hold the recognize and resist position properly understood.
Yeah, one thing I'd bring up that I haven't heard many people mention about the SSPX, that like when they talk about the excommunications in particular in 1988. They appeal to various interpretations of canon law to claim that they weren't valid. But really, the clear reality of it is that they wouldn't care even if there were, even if it was, even if they accepted the excommunications were valid, they wouldn't care. And we know that because they have a sister organization called the Society of St. Josephat in Ukraine, which has been formally excommunicated by the leader of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. And there's no dispute about that because automatic excommunications don't exist in the Eastern churches, and they don't care. They continue to ordain their priests because this sister organization doesn't have their own bishops. So there's no dispute, and there can't be any dispute over the validity of this excommunication, and they continue to act as though it doesn't provide them any impediments whatsoever. And in particular, with the war going on, you can see on the SSPX website lots of articles promoting the Society of St. Josephat.
And the Society won't appeal to the teachings of Trent or Pius XII on juridical mission and the necessity of mission. being carried out as a matter of divine law, what they will ultimately do, you can watch all their videos, and what they ultimately do is they appeal to their rule of faith, which isn't the Roman Catholic Church. The Society of St. Pius X's rule of faith is Archbishop Lefebvre, the cult of personality. Lefebvre is their rule of faith. He is the one they defer to. In all their videos, they say, we stand by Lefebvre, even where they're unable to reconcile the contradictions in their positions. For example, a priest will profess that the Roman Catholic Church is a visible, hierarchical, juridical structure containing a pope with bishops and dioceses, etc. And then when it comes to the fact that they're not a part of the Roman Catholic Church juridically, nor do they have a mission from the Roman Catholic Church, what do? They chalk it up to mystery, and they say this is the position of Archbishop Lefebvre. Once we can show, I believe, once we can show that the Archbishop held many, many errors and even heresies, I hope that the dominoes are going to start to fall. Now, I'm afraid that they're so ingrained in their position that they really don't care that Lefebvre held heresies. I mean, and that's what happens when you're externally separated from the church, unfortunately. You're cut off from the church, God forbid, from the life of grace. But, I think if you can show that this Archbishop, far from being this champion of orthodoxy, which we were all conditioned to believe as traditional Catholics, he was far from it. He frankly was a father of schism and error. And most of the errors in the traditional movement started with him and sprung from him, including Sedevacantism and the resistance to the resistance and the independence and so forth. So people need to re-examine the teachings of Archbishop Lefebvre, which are all in his books and all on the Society's websites. And I think once they do a deeper dive, they're going to get a much different picture of him.
Yeah, no, it is very troubling, I would think, if you were an SSPX supporter, the fact that some of the leading figures in Sedevacantism went to Lefebvre Seminary in Econ. In particular, Sanborn and Chicada both went there.
They even claimed that they got their ideas from Archbishop Lefebvre. Now, in fairness to Archbishop Lefebvre, he didn't publicly declare he was a Sedevacantist, but at least Father Chicada and the gang of nine claimed that there was a basis for their position from the teachings of the Archbishop. That's their words, not mine.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not, trying to say that Lefebvre was a Sedevacantist. But it just, I think it should be pretty troubling that that's where a large part of the modern Sedevacantist movement sprung forth from. But yeah, so moving on, this is the last question I had written down. But do you believe that the Novus Ordo Mass is intrinsically illicit? I know you talk about the promulgation of the Novus Ordo in the book, and you argue that the promulgation did not have the note of disciplinary infallibility because of how it was proclaimed. But as far as I could tell, you didn't take a positive position one way or another about whether or not it was illicit, despite not having that mark of positive infallibility.
Well, yeah, I mean, even 6 years ago when we wrote that chapter, we didn't believe it was illicit, and that's our position today. That the rite itself is clearly licit. It was at least, if not legally promulgated, set forth by the supreme authority. We've always maintained, and I continue to maintain, and this is why I was jumping around from one Novus Ordo parish to another over 20 years ago, was because a lot of the accidental elements, I would call them, that have been introduced into the way the liturgy is celebrated, those elements are illicit. That doesn't render the rite itself illicit, but it's the way it's celebrated that raises the question of these elements. For example, lay ministers of the Eucharist, where there's no necessity. This has almost become a common practice. In my view, extremely problematic, raises the question of sacrilege. I think without a case of necessity there, that would be an illicit practice. The Protestant music, the way that they have, totally divested some of these churches from beauty, deviations from the rubrics. I mean, those are illicit elements, but again, they operate on the accidental level, the appearance of what's going on during the liturgical celebration. You've got to divorce that stuff from the rite itself as it was promulgated. I mean, if you look at the rite itself and you study the evolution of the Roman rite, the elements of the rite are Catholic. You can find each one of those elements in a century where it started. I mean, they're all there. And so we have a a video on our website of a Novus Ordo Mass that was celebrated in Oxford, England, where you can't tell the difference. I mean, there wasn't prayers at the foot of the altar of the last gospel, but the entire Mass is said ad orientem in Latin, consecration, sotto voce. The altar boys are responding to the prayers of the faithful. I mean, it's absolutely beautiful. There is absolutely nothing objectionable about it. It's beautiful. And it just shows that the Novus Ordo can be celebrated in a traditional manner, with traditional vestments, with traditional music, in Latin, ad orientem, communion on the tongue, right? So again, it's the elements that have been introduced that have sabotaged the rite, have made it appear ugly on its surface, but the substance of the rite is Catholic.
Okay, yeah, that's good to hear. One other question I thought about just in the intervening time was something I read several of your articles about on your website, which is very interesting. Is the question of whether or not the SSPX attending SSPX Mass fulfills your Sunday obligation?
No, it doesn't. And a number of bishops throughout the country have made that judgment based upon Canon 1248. I should point out, though, there is a distinction between attending a society mass, let's say during the week, versus attending a society mass on a Sunday for the purpose of fulfilling your obligation, versus attending a mass and receiving communion. Those are three separate fact patterns that have three different answers. And I have this all laid out in my article. But to answer your question directly, Canon 1248, which regulates how we as Catholics fulfill the divine law requirement to keep holy the Sabbath, we must attend Mass on a Sunday, and some of the bishops, of course, have said, evening masses on Saturday, vigil and anticipate. Attending Mass on Sunday in a Roman Catholic church, sui juris, that is lawfully established and part of the juridical structure of the church on the map of the church, with the celebration of a valid liturgical rite that's in union with the local bishop and the Holy Father. And that just makes sense, because if you could, and I don't mean the physical building of the Catholic Church, I mean the Mass is celebrated in union with the bishop. Okay, if the bishop has given permission to have a Mass celebrated somewhere else, of course, but it is in union with the bishop. It is a diocesan in the Latin or Roman rite. It would be a diocesan parish generally. There are other ways, but a diocesan parish, most people are familiar with, that's in union with the bishop and union in Rome. And so it's not just a matter of a valid ordination and a valid liturgical missal. The church has to be lawfully established under the bishop's authority and in union with the bishop and the Roman pontiff to satisfy the obligation. And that's what is lacking with the society chapels, because the society chapels are not considered churches under ecclesiastical law. The society itself is not a juridic person, if you will, under the Code of Canon Law. All the society is a confederation of clergy that wander, that are vagus. They don't have a bishop. They're not under any type of authority, and hence aren't even celebrating masses in Catholic churches that would be recognized as churches under the church's law. So that's the issue. That's the issue. In order to satisfy your obligation, you have to celebrate a valid liturgical rite in a Catholic church.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much everything I had for today. Thank you very much for joining me, John Salza. I really enjoyed this interview. Is there any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
Well, I thank you for the opportunity. And again, I say this over and over again, I'm trying to fight for Catholic tradition, but I'm trying to do it, within the mission of the church and how Christ has set up his church. And I do believe that while there are many, many errors on the left, and we all know what they are, there's been an overreaction to the crisis. And we call these errors of excess on the right. Catholics need to take a look at these things and recognize that they need to be served by priests that have divine mission from the church. We cannot seek solutions outside of the church. Our Lord, if we're going to suffer, and we're going to suffer, and we deserve to suffer for our sins, we have to weather the storm at the foot of the cross like Our Lady, and that means remaining inside the church. So that would be my message to all my traditional friends.
Okay, thanks. Like I said at the beginning, the website for the book, as well as many other articles, is linked in the description. So if anyone's interested in that stuff, please check it out. Also, I meant to say this earlier, but I forgot. I have linked in the pinned section in chat a GoFundMe for a family who recently lost their house. The person in question is the person in question is a sort of member of some of these communities. So I would I would encourage the viewers, if you have any extra money, to please chip in a little bit. But thank you again, Salza, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. God bless you.